I'm joined now by James Murray, who's the Exchequer Secretary to the Treasury and the MP for Ealing North. Minister, lovely to see you this morning. Thank you for your time on a Sunday. So the Office for Budget Responsibility says that 60% of the national insurance hike will be passed on to working people. So you have taxed working people. You did lie in your manifesto.
No, in our manifesto, we were very clear that we wouldn't increase taxes on working people. And if working people look at their pay slips that they get after this budget, they won't see any increase in income tax or national insurance. To address specifically the point around employers' national insurance, we're not denying the fact that the change to employers' national insurance will have consequences. It was a very difficult decision, probably the most tough decision we took in the budget package overall, but it's essential to make sure we fix the foundations to fix the public finances, because that economic stability is crucial for growth.
So you're just excusing it on the basis of different wording. You've said that you're not putting up income tax or VAT or national insurance on actual employees, but the OBR says that 60% of the costs will be passed on to workers and consumers via lower wages and higher prices. So can we please agree that you have indirectly ended up taxing working people?
The studio lights were blazing, the cameras rolling, and what happened next left the entire nation speechless. A Labour MP walked onto that set, confident, prepared, even cocksure. But within minutes, Camilla Tominey had reduced their carefully crafted talking points to absolute rubble. This wasn't just another political interview. This was a masterclass in journalistic demolition that has sent shockwaves through Westminster and left Keir Starmer's office in absolute chaos. The footage is spreading like wildfire. The clips are going viral and the fallout is only just beginning. What you're about to witness is the moment when political spin met cold, hard reality, and reality won in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The tension in the studio was palpable from the very first second. Camilla Tominey sat across from the Labour MP with that look in her eyes the one seasoned politicians have learnt to fear. She had done her homework, she had the receipts, and she was about to deploy them with surgical precision. The MP, whose name is now trending across every social media platform for all the wrong reasons, had clearly expected a routine interview, perhaps a few softballs about Labour's latest policy announcements, maybe some gentle probing about the party's plans for the upcoming session. What they got instead was an interrogation that will haunt their political career for years to come. Tominey didn't waste a single second on pleasantries. Her opening question landed like a thunderbolt, cutting straight through the prepared statements and rehearsed sound bites the MP had clearly spent hours perfecting. She brought up the numbers, the ones Labour had been desperately trying to bury beneath layers of political rhetoric and carefully worded press releases. The MP's face changed instantly. The confident smile faltered. The eyes darted briefly to someone off camera, perhaps a handler or advisor, searching desperately for a lifeline that would never come. Tominey pressed forward, her voice steady, her facts unassailable, her determination absolute. The MP attempted to deflect, tried to pivot to their talking points, those safe harbours of political language designed to say everything while meaning nothing. But Tominey was having absolutely none of it. She interrupted, not rudely, but firmly, bringing the conversation back to the question that remained unanswered. The viewers at home could sense it. The people in the studio could feel it. This was not going according to plan for Labour. The MP stammered, started a sentence, stopped, started again. The polished veneer of political professionalism was cracking in real time, and millions were watching it happen. Then came the moment that has now been clipped, shared and replayed thousands of times across the internet. Tominey produced documentation, actual evidence that directly contradicted what the MP had just claimed. The silence that followed was deafening. The MP's mouth opened, but no words came out. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing every micro-expression, every bead of sweat, every desperate calculation happening behind those eyes. This was the moment when the interview transformed from political theatre into something far more raw and real. The MP finally attempted a response, but it was feeble, unconvincing. The kind of answer that satisfies no one and raises 100 new questions. Tominey sensed the weakness like a shark sensing blood in the water. She circled back, approached from a different angle, closed off every possible escape route the MP might have been contemplating. The parliamentary training that Labour MPs receive clearly hadn't prepared this individual for this level of scrutiny. The safe spaces of Westminster, where politicians speak to other politicians in their own coded language, had not equipped them for this encounter with actual accountability. Back in Downing Street, you can imagine the scene unfolding in real time. Advisors huddled around screens watching in growing horror as one of their own was systematically dismantled on national television. Phones started ringing, suckers started flying. Someone needed to do damage control and they needed to do it fast. But what could they possibly say? The interview was live, the damage was happening in real time, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. Tominey moved to her next line of questioning, and somehow it was even more devastating than what had come before. She brought up quotes as statements the Labour leadership had made just weeks earlier that directly contradicted the position the MP was now trying to defend. The MP's attempts to explain away these contradictions became increasingly desperate. They talked about context, about nuance, about the complexity of modern governance. But to viewers at home, it sounded like what it was, someone caught in an uncomfortable truth, trying desperately to talk their way out of it. The beauty of Tominey's approach was its simplicity. She wasn't grandstanding, she wasn't making it about herself. She was simply asking questions and insisting on actual answers. In an era where political interviews often feel more like performance art than journalism, this was a refreshing and devastating return to the fundamentals. Ask a question, get an answer. If the answer doesn't make sense, then ask again. If the answer contradicts previous statements, point that out. It's basic journalism, but executed with such precision and determination that it became something extraordinary. Social media erupted almost immediately. Clips from the interview started circulating before the segment had even finished. People from across the political spectrum, many of whom rarely agree on anything, found common ground in their amazement at what they were witnessing. This wasn't about left or right, Labour or Conservative. This was about accountability, about transparency, about whether politicians can simply say whatever they want without consequence. And for once, the answer was a resounding no. The MP made one final attempt to regain control, tried to steer the conversation toward what they clearly considered safer ground. But Tominey was relentless. She had more questions, more evidence, more contradictions to explore. Each answer the MP provided seemed only to dig the hole deeper. It was like watching someone try to put out a fire with gasoline. Each desperate attempt to salvage the situation only making things worse. The interview continued to spiral, and what made it particularly devastating was that Tominey wasn't relying on gotcha journalism or cheap tricks. Every question was legitimate, every point she raised was backed by verifiable facts, and every contradiction she highlighted was drawn directly from Labour's own statements and policy documents. The MP sitting across from her was being undone not by some external enemy, but by their own party's inconsistencies and the gap between what Labour says and what Labour does. This is what made the whole spectacle so compelling and so damaging. There was nowhere to hide, no convenient scapegoat to blame, no way to dismiss Tominey as biased or unfair. She was simply holding up a mirror, and the reflection was absolutely devastating. As the segment progressed, viewers began to notice something else entirely. The MP's body language had completely transformed from the confident politician who had walked onto that set. The shoulders had slumped, the gestures had become more defensive, the voice had lost its authoritative edge. This was someone who had realised, perhaps for the first time in their political career, that the usual tactics weren't going to work. The deflections that worked in Parliament, where friendly MPs provide supportive interventions, had no power here. The vague promises that satisfy party loyalists couldn't stand up to direct questioning. The talking points that sound impressive in echo chambers crumbled under the weight of actual scrutiny. Tominey then shifted her focus to the economic policies Labour had been championing, and this is where things became truly uncomfortable for the MP. She brought up specific numbers. Specific projections, specific promises that had been made to the British public. Then she contrasted those promises with the actual outcomes, with the reality on the ground, with what independent economists and analysts were saying. The gap between rhetoric and reality was staggering, and the MP had no credible explanation for it. They tried to talk about external factors, about circumstances beyond their control, about the complexity of economic management. But Tominey was prepared for every deflection, countering with examples of how Labour had previously claimed credit for positive developments while now attempting to distance themselves from negative outcomes. The really damaging moment came when Tominey brought up statements from ordinary citizens, people who had believed Labour's promises and were now facing the consequences of policies that hadn't delivered as advertised. She read out their words, their frustrations, their sense of betrayal. The MP tried to respond with statistics and economic jargon, but it rang hollow. Here was the fundamental disconnect laid bare for everyone to see. The politicians speaking in their sanitised language of policy and percentage points, while real people were dealing with real consequences in their daily lives. The MP's inability to address this human dimension with anything other than prepared talking points was perhaps more damaging than any of the factual contradictions Tominey had exposed. What happened next has become the most shared clip from the entire interview. Tominey asked a simple, direct question about accountability. If Labour's policies weren't delivering the promised results, who was responsible? Would anyone face consequences? Would there be any acknowledgement of failure? The MP's response was a masterclass in political evasion, a long-winded answer that somehow managed to avoid actually answering the question. Tominey let them finish, waited just long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable, and then simply said that the MP hadn't answered the question and repeated it word for word. The MP tried again with the same result. By the third time Tominey repeated the question, even the most casual viewer could see what was happening. This was political accountability dying in real time. Back in Labour headquarters, the panic must have been reaching fever pitch. This wasn't just one bad interview. This was a defining moment that would be weaponised by opponents for months, possibly years to come. Every quote, every hesitation, every failed deflection was being recorded, clipped and prepared for endless replay. The MP's performance, or lack thereof, would become a case study in how not to handle a challenging interview. But more than that, it exposed something deeper about Labour's current position. They had built their political strategy on promises and presentations, but when someone actually dug into the substance, when someone demanded real answers to real questions, the entire edifice collapsed. Tominey wasn't finished yet. She moved to questions about party unity, about the tensions within Labour that everyone knew existed, but that the party desperately tried to keep behind closed doors. The MP's attempts to present a united front were undermined by Tominey's citations of recent leaks, anonymous briefings, and public disagreements between different Labour factions. The picture she painted was of a party fundamentally divided on key issues, but trying desperately to maintain a facade of unity for electoral purposes. The MP's denials became increasingly implausible as Tominey stacked evidence upon evidence, quote upon quote, demonstrating that Labour's internal conflicts were far deeper than the party wanted to admit. The interview was approaching its conclusion, but Tominey had saved perhaps her most pointed question for last. She asked about Keir Starmer's leadership directly, about whether the MP had full confidence in the direction the party was heading. It was a question designed to create a no-win scenario. Answer yes, and the MP would be endorsing policies and approaches that had just been thoroughly discredited during the interview. Answer no, and the MP would be publicly breaking with their own party leader on national television. The MP chose to answer yes, but the hesitation before responding, the lack of conviction in their voice, the carefully qualified language they used, all told a different story. It was a moment of brutal honesty, despite the dishonest answer, if such a thing is possible. The aftermath of the interview has been nothing short of explosive, and the reverberations are still being felt across the entire political landscape. Within hours of the broadcast ending, the clips had been viewed millions of times across every major social media platform. Political commentators from across the spectrum weighed in, and remarkably there was near unanimous agreement that this had been a catastrophic performance for Labour. Opposition parties immediately seized upon the interview as evidence of everything they had been saying about Labour's credibility problem. Conservative MPs were quoting sections of the interview in Parliament within days. Reform UK used clips in their campaign materials. Even Liberal Democrats, usually more restrained in their attacks, couldn't resist pointing out the contradictions and evasions that Tominey had so effectively exposed. But the real damage wasn't coming from political opponents, it was coming from within Labour's own support base. Grassroots members took to social media expressing their frustration and embarrassment at how their party had been represented. Long-time Labour voters started questioning whether the party they had supported for decades still deserved their loyalty. The comment sections under news articles about the interview were filled with people saying they felt betrayed, misled and disappointed. These weren't Conservative voters celebrating an opponent's misfortune. These were Labour's own people expressing genuine disillusionment with how far the party seemed to have drifted from its principles and how unwilling it appeared to be to accept accountability for its failures. The media feeding frenzy that followed was intense and unrelenting. Newspapers across the political spectrum ran front-page stories analysing the interview frame by frame. Television news programmes dedicated entire segments to discussing what had gone wrong and what it meant for Labour's future. Political analysts debated whether this was an isolated incident or symptomatic of deeper problems within the party. Some argued that the MP had simply been unprepared and that better media training could prevent similar disasters. Others contended that no amount of training could overcome the fundamental problems of defending indefensible positions and explaining away obvious contradictions. The consensus seemed to be that Labour had suffered a serious blow to its credibility at precisely the moment it could least afford it. Keir Starmer's office initially tried to contain the damage with the usual strategies. They issued carefully worded statements supporting the MP, while subtly distancing the leadership from some of the more problematic statements made during the interview. They briefed friendly journalists with alternative narratives and talking points designed to change the conversation. They tried to pivot attention to other issues and announcements, but none of it worked. The interview had taken on a life of its own, and the public appetite for discussing it seemed insatiable. Every attempt to move on was met with demands for proper answers to the questions Tominey had raised. The usual political playbook for managing bad news cycles was proving completely ineffective. What made the situation even worse for Labour was that Tominey herself became part of the story in the best possible way for a journalist. She was being praised across the industry for her preparation, her tenacity, and her refusal to accept non-answers. Other journalists started pointing to the interview as an example of what political journalism should look like. There were calls for more of this kind of rigorous questioning and less of the softball interviews that had become all too common. Tominey had inadvertently set a new standard, and politicians from all parties were now worried that they might face similar scrutiny in future interviews. The days of getting away with vague answers and polished deflections suddenly seemed numbered. Behind the scenes at Labour headquarters, there were reportedly furious arguments about who was to blame for the debacle. Some blamed the MP for poor performance and inadequate preparation. Others blamed the media team for not properly briefing the MP on potential difficult questions. Still others blamed the leadership for putting the party in a position where its policies and statements were so contradictory that they couldn't withstand basic scrutiny. The finger-pointing and recriminations were exactly what Labour didn't need at a time when it desperately required unity and message discipline. But that's what happens when a political party is exposed so thoroughly and so publicly. The cracks that were always there suddenly become impossible to ignore. The polling that came out in the days following the interview made grim reading for Labour strategists. The party's approval ratings had taken a measurable hit, particularly on key issues like economic competence and trustworthiness. Focus groups revealed that voters who had been considering supporting Labour were now having second thoughts. The phrases that kept coming up were variations of, if they can't even handle a simple interview, how can they handle running the country? This is the nightmare scenario for any political party, when a single event becomes a symbol of broader perceived incompetence and untrustworthiness. Labour was now fighting not just against the specific damage from this interview, but against the narrative it had created about their fitness for government. What's particularly striking about this entire episode is how it demonstrates the power of actual journalism in an age of political spin and media management. For years, politicians have become increasingly skilled at controlling their message, staying on script and avoiding real accountability. They have built entire industries around media training and message discipline. But Camilla Tominey proved that when a journalist is properly prepared, genuinely determined, and willing to push past the usual evasions, the Emperor's new clothes become visible to everyone. She didn't need to be aggressive or confrontational. She simply needed to be persistent and factual, and that was enough to completely dismantle the carefully constructed political facade. The long-term implications of this interview are still unfolding, but one thing is clear, this isn't going away anytime soon. The video will be replayed every time Labour makes grand promises or tries to avoid accountability. It will be referenced in election campaigns and political debates. It will be studied in media courses as an example of effective journalism, and in political science classes as an example of catastrophic communication failure. The MP involved may never fully recover their credibility, and Labour as a party has been dealt a blow that will take considerable time and effort to overcome. And all of it happened because one journalist decided to ask questions and actually insist on getting answers. In the end, that's all it took to expose the hollow core of Labour's current political positioning, and that might be the most damaging revelation of all.